Whitechapel, a neighborhood of shadows and secrets, cobblestones and crime, a Victorian slum where police rub shoulders with prostitutes.
Come on then, I know a spot. Why so nervous?
It's not your first time, is it?
Don't worry about that copper. He won't be back for ages.
But tonight, a figure from hell emerges, and a legend is born.
Jack the Ripper did just that. He ripped. He stabbed and he ripped.
Jack the Ripper, the man that the police couldn't catch. He was gliding in, committing murder, gliding out again. He was beating Scotland Yard on their doorstep.
I don't think that the story can ever be completely closed.
Jack the Ripper embodies the fear that we all have of the shadows. That thing that's there that we don't know what it is, we can offer no protection against it.
In 1888, there was a 10-week period known as the Autumn of Terror. It was in this period that the Jack the Ripper murders took place. There are a number of arguments about how many victims there were, but the generally accepted number is 5, the canonical 5.
It wasn't so much that these poor women were being murdered, but it was the manner in which they were being murdered. The bodies were horrifically mutilated, eviscerated, slashed to ribbons in some cases. They were just being butchered. And that is a terrifying, terrifying atmosphere to live in, as indeed it would be today.
The gruesome pull of Jack the Ripper brings several experts to a pub on the outskirts of London.
We're talking about Tabram.
Ancient clues and well-worn details are examined again.
The cutting only takes place on the ground. First cut through the left carotid artery, the second blow cut down to the vertebrae, then the mutilation takes place. So you do not need a stabbing weapon.
Effectively, ripperologists are historians. Ripperologists produce a lot of very good, solid, sound information, and it's on a range of subjects that aren't just involved in Jack the Ripper.
Now, the consensus of opinion was that the knife that did the damage on these murders was double-edged. Ouch, shouldn't do that. And approximately 6 to 8 inches long. And the other thing to remember about knives when you're stabbing people is you really do want a quillion. This is this bit here.
It's protecting your own hand, presumably.
That's right.
Well, again, at that area, you've got a lot of slaughterhouses in the area.
Yes.
Knives would be considered tools of trade.
By 1888, the Industrial Revolution has drawn tens of thousands to London, the poor and the desperate, seeking a better life. But the reality is grinding poverty. Many are trapped in a slum where 90,000 people scrape by.
Whitechapel had been an immigrant area since the 17th century. In this area, it was 800 people to an acre. Outside this area, it was 50 to an acre, which gives you some idea of the overcrowding.
And of course, at about this time, you had the pogroms in Russia and Eastern Europe, where the Russians were cracking down on Jews and driving them from their land. This was the entrance to Britain. This is where everybody came. And of course, if you were poor, you didn't leave. This is where you stayed.
Once you got to the East End of London, there wasn't anywhere else lower that you could go to. It was really the Skid Row.
The poorest of the poor were Whitechapel's women. All they have left to sell are their bodies.
Well, the victims are what we would regard today as casual prostitutes. They weren't professional prostitutes. They were forced to sell themselves just to get enough money to survive.
They were alcoholic, they were poor, and they carried their home with them. By that I mean their clothes. They didn't wear just one skirt, they wore perhaps 2 or 3. The few possessions they had, they carried in a bag underneath one of the skirts. We're looking at a comb, some tea, some sugar, a piece of broken mirror.
On August 31st, the autumn of horror begins. Mary Ann Nichols, whose friends call her Polly, will soon be known as victim number 1.
By her own admission, she'd made her lodging money 3 times that day and drunk the lot. She was wearing a black straw bonnet which was trimmed with black velvet. She deemed this to be some kind of aid to earning money.
Abandoned by her husband and estranged from her 5 children, Polly has survived on the streets for almost a decade.
Being in her mid-40s by this time, and being a drunk prostitute in Whitechapel, she was not what you call the greatest catch. From approximately 2:30 until her body was found at 3:40 a.m. we have no idea what she was doing. There was no sightings.
Mary Ann Nichols was found lying in Bucks Row, Whitechapel, where she was lying in the street at 20 to 4 in the morning, and a guy going to work came across her body lying on the footpath.
He was under the immediate impression that she was drunk, but when he looked closely at her, he could see that she had her throat cut.
It was only when she was taken to the mortuary and the corpse was stripped that it was realised that she'd been basically eviscerated. That murder really caught the public attention and shocked people.
But the horror has just started. A savage killer stalks the streets. Soon, the cobblestones of Whitechapel will be stained with more blood. The blood of his first victim runs in the streets of Whitechapel. The legend of Jack the Ripper has begun, one that echoes 100 years later.
Now, if the knife was carried up the sleeve in a sheath, I can't put it all the way up, and you did that, when the person's on the ground, all you have to do is withdraw the knife and bring it across. The blood goes that way, it doesn't go onto you, and you've done the slash. When they're down, then you can do the second slash.
There is a small element of ghoulishness to it, but you've always got to keep hold of the fact that what we're doing is talking about real people, women who suffered needlessly, who didn't deserve what happened to them.
The very first thing that struck me was that she looks like one of us, meaning one of my family, because the resemblance, even though the very first time I saw it, it was very shocking. And I think because I knew it was a death photo, and I thought I could have been looking at a picture of my own mother.
For Maureen Nichols, the legend is much more personal. She recently discovered she is a descendant of the Ripper's first victim. She's come here from Canada to learn more about the tragic life of her ancestor.
My great-great-grandmother was murdered in London, and that, of course, is a famous case, Mary Ann Nichols. I know that Mary Ann Nichols has been dead for many, many years, but I still feel she deserves to have someone in her family treat her like her life and her death were important.
Maureen, hello.
Nice to meet you.
finally meet you. Yeah, it sounds odd, but I can actually see the family resemblance.
Thank you.
Welcome to a lovely Whitechapel. Busy Whitechapel Road. Every day you come here. It's a thriving market. It's always busy. You'll never come through here and see this quiet nearly 100 years later.
Yeah.
But it's exactly the same spot. Because the building we're at now the Shiraz Balti Cuisine, this was the Frying Pan pub, and this is where Polly was drinking. This was the last building she was actually seen in. Very often to stay in a lodging house, you had to have generally 4p a night for your bed. And of course prostitution nowadays is regarded as some kind of moral decay, but it was an act of pure necessity. The majority of poor women around here would find themselves a prostitute even briefly for some period in their lives because there was no other means of survival. It was something that would have disgusted them to have to do, but that would get them the money they needed for their bed for the night.
It would be very sad to have to be walking around and in the cold and not knowing where you're going to sleep.
It is a desperate, dangerous way to make money. A decision thousands are forced to make in Whitechapel every day.
Now, if they managed to get together some money, and then they could go to one of the refuges that existed in the East End, and every night between 7,000 and 8,000 homeless men, women and children queued outside these to get a bed. The women would prostitute themselves. They would sell themselves for 3 pennies, 2 pennies, or a loaf of stale bread. That tells you the value that was on these women's bodies. It was a brutal, brutal existence. And it was these women that the man we call Jack the Ripper chose as his victims.
The studies now, it's not this rubbish about who is it. But this is the spot where Polly was murdered, I'm afraid. On the edge of what was a brown stable yard. The entrance was here. Polly's body was actually was found right next to the gate, projecting a little way into the street itself. The general consensus is that Polly was quickly throttled, so there wasn't a chance to cry out. People are always going on about this idea of because there was so much violence committed on the bodies after they died that he was some kind of sadist, but perverted and mentally unstable certainly. But he didn't torture anyone that he killed. They were throttled into unconsciousness fairly quickly, and all the brutality with the knives was done during unconsciousness or indeed after death.
It's very, very sad to think that anybody would end up dying in such a terrible way. And of course she died many, many years before I was born, but it's still, she's one of my people, and to think that somebody that would be in my family would have that happen it's just unspeakable. I don't even know how to put it into words.
September 8th, 1888. It's been just 1 week since the murder of Mary Ann Nichols, when the Ripper strikes again.
Annie Chapman, number 2. She had children. One of them was terribly handicapped and crippled. Her husband was a coachman. He eventually died of cirrhosis of the liver.
Her husband's death pushes Annie Chapman into the streets of Whitechapel. Another desperate woman working in the shadows.
Now, the prostitutes would know quiet locations where they could go with a customer. Annie Chapman knew the backyard of 29 Hanbury Street, which was regularly used by prostitutes. And so they go to a dark corner, and unwittingly the prostitute assists in her own death.
Possibly because the killer had longer and was more hidden, the mutilations to this poor woman were even more horrific. She had been completely disemboweled and her intestines thrown over her shoulder. Also, there were parts of her body that were found to be missing.
And this brutality and mutilation was something certainly unknown in this country. I mean, you'd had the odd gruesome murder, but with victims left on the street in full display with all these horrific injuries was something really quite new.
The atmosphere during that period was absolutely incredible. It's like today when you're walking along the street not knowing whether there's a bomb going to go off any minute. And this was the late Victorian version of a car bomb, if you like, exploding right in the middle of the masses. Terrifying.
The uncertainty and horror feed another animal, Britain's tabloid press. Newspapers latched on to the murders of Chapman and Nichols, the stories fanning the fear.
Before then, newspapers were, broadly speaking, just solid blocks of very, very small type. All of a sudden, you could have dozens of exciting photographs. And of course, if you could get chopped up bodies and female nudity all on the front page, you had a winner. All the population could now devour the news. And of course, they really went for it.
One of the newspapers started reporting the murders as the romance of the East End. I mean, these are very common and brutal murders. Romance is an astonishing word to use in such a context.
The height of the Ripper scare, they were printing 2 or 3 editions a day, and these were selling out as soon as they hit the sidewalk. People were fighting for newspapers. Little boys ran through the streets with newspapers over their arm, shouting the famous cry, "Horrible murder! Horrible murder!"
The cry will continue to echo through the Whitechapel streets. Soon, more bodies will raise more questions and launch a frantic hunt for a killer. August 1888. A brutal killer rules the London night. 2 savage murders in as many weeks. But who is Jack the Ripper? And why can't the police catch him?
One of the detectives involved in the investigation was asked by a reporter, "Did you have any suspects?" And he threw up his hands in horror and said, "Suspects? We had far too many suspects."
You have something like over 1,000 letters a week going into Scotland Yard, pointing the finger at X, Y, or Z. I mean, some of the examples are absolutely ludicrous. They reckon Jack the Ripper was an orangutan leaping over the roofs of Whitechapel.
If somebody looked suspicious, then you get a gang of people on the street pursuing some innocent person who'd been accused of being the Ripper.
Overwhelmed with suspects, the police struggle to cope. Then, one sinister character emerges.
One of the first suspects to come to light was a man called Leatherapron, this ghoul-like character that was out there. This man was supposed to be terrorising the local prostitutes and extorting money from them.
The police tell us in the reports that a local man, John Pizer, was known as Leatherapron because he wore a leather apron in his trade. The main reason he came under suspicion was that he had been seen, allegedly, with Chapman before she was murdered.
He was also supposed to be Jewish, and that had a big anti-Semitic kickback in the East End at the time.
And so you get pieces written about no Englishman would have committed such a murder, it has to be a foreigner. By foreigner, Jew.
Pizer is quickly cleared and dismissed. The case grows more confusing. Letters are sent to police and newspapers.
The most famous letter of all is the letter which is sent to the Central News Agency beginning "Dear Boss" and signed Jack the Ripper.
With the name Jack the Ripper, this became the first really international serial killer, if you like. The name was broadcast across to America, Canada, France, Germany, all over the world, in fact.
But the name Jack the Ripper has become synonymous with not only a serial killer, but a serial killer who hacks and mutilates his victims.
Yeah. I mean, it just grabs, I mean, it's a brand name. And yet the ridiculous thing is, the number of murders committed by Jack the Ripper is quite small. You compare it with the Yorkshire Ripper, you compare him with Ted Bundy and all sorts of other killers, and Jack fades into complete insignificance. And it's just the thing that keeps it going is that name.
It's September 30th, 1888. 3 weeks since the last murder. The fear that grips Whitechapel becomes reality again.
They were pretty desperate women, and when interviewed by a police officer, one of them said, "Well, it's either Jack the Ripper or suicide for me."
The Ripper's third victim is Elizabeth Stride, known as Long Liz. An immigrant from Sweden, Liz is pulled into the Whitechapel slums to survive. But her murder is different.
She was found with her throat cut, and no mutilations were found on the body.
He's disturbed on that killing, and we don't know what the motives are, but he has to get a second victim.
He wasn't after their death. He was after their obliteration. He had an overwhelming desire to destroy, not to kill, but to destroy. That's something entirely different.
That desire fuels the Ripper's rage. He isn't satisfied with Stride's death. It was too quick, too easy. Just an hour later, he meets 46-year-old Catherine Eddowes.